Setting the stage/opening image. The United Nations General Assembly chamber was packed, shoulder to shoulder with diplomats, cameras, and tension so thick it felt like humidity before a lightning storm. Every delegate knew today wasn't going to be routine. The world had been watching the rising death toll in Gaza, and now, two men, polar opposites in philosophy, power, and purpose, were set to collide. Benjamin Netanyahu arrived first. His steps echoed as he entered the chamber, flanked by stern-faced security guards. He wore his usual armor, a navy suit, sharp tie, and an expression carved from years of political battle. But the weight behind his walk wasn't confidence, it was defiance. He was here not to explain, but to justify. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traoré. No entourage. No script, just calm defiance in a brown officer's uniform and boots that had seen real ground, not red carpets. The room didn't just look at him, it leaned toward him. Traoré didn't carry the polished presence of Western-trained leaders. He carried something more dangerous, conviction, the hook/the inciting incident. As Netanyahu took the podium and began his speech, speaking of security, terrorism, and Israel's right to defend, the murmurs began. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, some looked down, others checked their translation headsets. But Traoré, he stared straight at Netanyahu, unmoving. And then, as if the silence of the world was waiting for a storm, Traoré stood. Without waiting for applause or permission, he walked to the front. Netanyahu's voice faltered. Cameras turned. The hall, so often a theater of performance, was now a battleground of presence. Theme stated/debate begins. Traoré didn't need a microphone to be heard. His voice was low, but his words cut deep. You speak of defense. But you rain bombs on children. You speak of peace. But your hands are red. And now, the world watches, not through your media, but through the blood on your boots. The room went breathless. The war wasn't just in Gaza anymore. It was now on the floor of the United Nations. And Traoré had just fired the first diplomatic shot. Rising tension/crossing the threshold. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being interrupted, certainly not by a 36-year-old African captain who didn't play by the unwritten rules of international diplomacy. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but before he could raise his voice or reclaim the podium, Traoré continued, his tone steady, his words unforgiving. I am not here to debate policy, he said, turning slowly toward the crowd. I am here because silence is complicity. And too many of you, too many of us, have been silent while children in Gaza sleep in rubble, if they sleep at all. Delegates whispered. Journalists scribbled furiously. Some representatives shifted in their seats, torn between discomfort and awe. Obstacles appear/allies and enemies revealed. Behind Netanyahu, his aides exchanged anxious glances. One of them tapped a phone, likely alerting Israeli PR teams to brace for impact. Across the chamber, U.S. Delegate J.D. Vance leaned into his mic but thought better of speaking. Traoré had seized the room. Then, from the South African row, a quiet clap echoed. Then another, from Bolivia. One by one, small nations, often overlooked, joined with nods and soft applause. Traoré had done what few could, he broke the illusion that Netanyahu stood unchallenged. Netanyahu stepped forward, his voice like a blade. Captain, you come from a nation that knows nothing of war with terror. Your outrage is misplaced, your understanding, naive. But Traoré didn't blink. Naive, he echoed. No. I've seen children die in the arms of mothers too poor to bury them. I've seen minds run by foreign interests while our people starve. Don't confuse pain with weakness. New stakes introduced/emotional core. He turned once more to the assembly. I speak for no interest but justice. And if this institution still means anything, it must say enough. Because if we do not, then we are not a council of nations, we are a council of cowards. Silence followed, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of truth. Traoré had crossed the threshold. This was no longer about Gaza alone. It was about the global system that allowed such violence to go unchecked. And as Netanyahu stood frozen behind him, the world, finally, was watching. Tests, allies, enemies/rising action deepens. The Israeli Prime Minister wasn't one to back down. Netanyahu regained his composure with the calm precision of a man seasoned in decades of conflict. He adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and leaned into the microphone. "Captain Traore," he said, voice low but laced with condescension, "you speak of justice, but fail to recognize the complexity of war. Hamas fires rockets from schools. Our enemies use hospitals as shields. What would you do?" The challenge hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a trap. Netanyahu expected Traore to stumble, to retreat into slogans. But Traore didn't move. He didn't even blink. Revelation/deepening conflict. "I would protect my people without burying others' children beneath the rubble," Traore answered. "I would not use trauma as a license for massacre. And I would never ask the world to applaud me for doing so." Gasps echoed. This wasn't diplomacy, it was defiance. An aide from the French delegation whispered, "Mon Dieu," as cameras zoomed in on Netanyahu's clenched fists. Meanwhile, in the African bloc, murmurs of approval spread like wildfire. Senegal, Ghana, Namibia, they weren't just listening. They were standing. This wasn't merely Traore versus Netanyahu anymore. This was a young continent rising against the old guard of selective justice. The middle point/turning the tide. Traore turned his body toward the General Assembly, scanning the faces of those too comfortable in their distance. "Let's be honest," he said. "Some of you say you want peace, but profit from war. You condemn violence, but only after your weapons have been sold." Now the tension snapped. A British delegate stood to object. An American senator shook his head in disbelief. Netanyahu leaned into his mic again, but Traore raised a hand, not arrogantly, but commandingly. "I'm not here for applause," he said. "I'm here for accountability. Transformation begins." The screen behind them, once filled with talking points and flags, flickered to life. Traore had requested one image before his speech, a photograph of a Gazan child holding a teddy bear amidst the rubble. It was now on full display, larger than life. And as eyes turned to it, the noise died. Because no spin, no talking point, no political counterpunch, could out-talk a child's stare. Enemies close in/stakes escalate. Netanyahu, now visibly rattled, attempted to reclaim control. He gestured for the image to be removed, but the Assembly's tech team, under the authority of the Secretary General, refused. The screen stayed. The child's stare remained. "You come here to moralize," Netanyahu snapped. "But Israel will do what it must. We will defend ourselves with or without your understanding. That child, if he exists, will not change our resolve." Gasps turned to murmurs. Some nodded in agreement. But many frowned. It wasn't just what Netanyahu said. It was how he said it, cold, dismissive, detached. And Traore saw the crack. Traore's internal shift/voice of the voiceless. "I don't question Israel's right to exist," Traore said calmly. "But I question its right to erase others in the process." The room held its breath. Traore walked toward the podium again, not waiting for permission. "If your security demands the destruction of neighborhoods, the starvation of civilians, and the bombing of hospitals, then maybe what you call security is just control in disguise." His voice grew sharper. "And if no one here will say it, I will. Gaza is not your punching bag. Palestine is not your testing ground." Rising support/breaking ranks. This time, the African bloc stood in unison. Some Latin American representatives followed. Even a Scandinavian diplomat stood, not for applause, but solidarity. A delegate from Brazil whispered, "This is the beginning of something." Meanwhile, the American ambassador shifted nervously. This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a reckoning. Midpoint reversal/unexpected allies and enemies. Then, unexpectedly, a voice joined in from across the chamber. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from the U.S. stood from her observer seat. "I support Israel's right to exist," she began, "but I also support the right of people to live, not just survive under occupation." All eyes turned. The U.S. delegation looked blindsided. Crockett continued, "We cannot claim to be champions of democracy while turning a blind eye to apartheid." The turning moment. Netanyahu's grip tightened around the edges of the podium. His dominance in that room, his ability to frame the narrative, was unraveling. And the one unraveling it wasn't a superpower. It was a captain from Burkina Faso, armed with only truth, pain, and clarity. The consequences intensify/isolation of power. Netanyahu's composure fractured. His face flushed, not with shame, but with anger. He wasn't used to this. For decades, Israel had shaped the conversation, dictated the tempo, and silenced opposition with political might. But now? In this moment? He was being challenged. Not by a Western power. Not by a superpower proxy. But by Ibrahim Traoré. A young captain from West Africa. A soldier who refused to kneel. Netanyahu leaned toward the microphone. "You call it occupation. I call it survival." Traoré stepped forward, unmoved. "And the children buried in rubble? Is that your definition of survival too?" Moral high ground/the voice of global conscience. A ripple of murmurs swept across the chamber. The image of the dead child still lingered on the screen behind them, a silent indictment. It wasn't just a statistic. It was proof. Traoré's tone hardened. "Africa knows what colonization looks like. We remember what it feels like. It wears many masks: protection, development, defense, but always ends the same. With blood in the soil and silence in the air." He turned to the audience. "And you, all of you, who claim neutrality in the face of slaughter. You're not neutral. You're complicit." The world reacts/the crowd fractures. One by one, more delegations stood. South Africa. Bolivia. Pakistan. Senegal. Yemen. The moral tide had shifted. Silence now felt like surrender. Even the French ambassador hesitated before finally rising. A few seconds later, she stood. And then, most shockingly, the Italian diplomat followed, visibly uneasy, but unwilling to remain seated. The personal cost/targeted resistance. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's aides scrambled. His government issued a formal complaint. Israeli media already painted Traoré as a destabilizing figure, a radical, an enemy of peace. But Traoré expected this. He had seen what truth cost. He had buried friends for less. And still, he stood taller. A global spark/the beginning of a shift. Back in Africa, millions were watching. In Ouagadougou, students gathered in cafes, holding their breath. In Accra, in Kigali, in Bamako, screens lit up with Traoré's words. He wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso anymore. He was speaking for every voice that had been ignored. Every border drawn in blood. Every child buried with no name. And the world? The world was finally listening. Shadows behind the curtain/power struggles begin. Behind closed doors, Western envoys scrambled. Phones buzzed. Emails surged. The American representative leaned in toward the British delegate. "He's shifting the narrative. We can't let that stand." It wasn't just what Traoré said, it was who was listening. And how many were standing now? Netanyahu's team demanded that the UN issue a formal rebuke. "This is incitement," they claimed. "He's fueling unrest." But the Secretary General refused. Quietly, but firmly. "Ibrahim Traoré," he said, "is exercising a right too often denied to leaders from his continent, the right to truth. An unlikely alliance/whispers in the hallways. As Traore exited the main chamber, he was approached, not by a fellow African leader, but by an unlikely face, the Chilean ambassador. "You gave voice to what many of us have whispered for years," she said. "It's time we speak louder." Traore nodded, his face calm. "Then let's not whisper anymore." Suddenly, new coalitions began forming, not out of politics, but principles. Not alliances of economy, but of conscience. Backlash mounts/the empire pushes back. Across U.S. media, the backlash was immediate. "Who does he think he is?" barked one Fox News anchor. "Ain't nobody with a microphone," another chimed in. Online, bots flooded hashtags with disinformation. Traore is funded by Iran. Traore is a Chinese puppet. Burkina Faso is destabilizing the West. But the people? The people weren't buying it. African youth, Middle Eastern students, even young Americans began reposting his speech. Memes spread like fire. Camera with flash, Traore versus the machine. Camera with flash, captain versus colonizer. Camera with flash, truth has no rank. The cost of defiance/warnings delivered. Back in Ouagadougou, a sealed envelope arrived at the presidential residence. No name. No return address. Inside, a photo of Traore, with a red X marked over his face. His aides urged him to cancel his next trip. His security chief doubled the guard. But Traore simply said, "Let them come." The world watches closer/the war of optics. Netanyahu appeared again the next day, flanked by flags, generals, and a carefully staged photo op. But something had shifted. The camera no longer flattered him. His words, once unquestioned, now sounded like echoes of the past. Meanwhile, Traore walked freely through the gardens, no entourage, no teleprompter. Just him, and reporters eager to hear what comes next. Escalation begins/the global stage trembles. The next morning, a rare emergency session was called. Not by the U.S. Not by Israel. But by Ghana. Co-signed by Algeria, Bolivia, Indonesia, and, unexpectedly, Ireland. The resolution? An immediate ceasefire and independent investigation into civilian bombings in Gaza. Netanyahu's camp erupted in fury. "This is an ambush," his spokesperson shouted. "This is Traore's doing," another snapped. And it was. But not with bullets. With truth. The vote that shook the hall/Traore watches silently. As countries cast their votes, tension built like a rising tide. Some abstained. Some yielded to pressure. But one after another, the yes votes lit up the screen behind the chamber. Traore didn't flinch. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He just watched. As the final vote tipped the resolution into passage, a quiet breath escaped his lips. Not victory, responsibility. Netanyahu reacts/rage behind the curtain. Inside his private suite, Netanyahu threw his briefing folder across the room. "He humiliated me. Me. Before the whole world," he shouted. His advisors remained silent. They had no counter. No plan. No leverage. The old tactics, fear, silence, narrative control, were failing. Traore's shadow grows/the movement expands. In South Africa, students marched in the streets with placards that read, "Blackheart, Burkina Faso speaks for us." Blackheart, the West no longer writes the script. Blackheart, Gaza. Congo. Haiti. Our struggles are won. In Paris, Algerian immigrants held up Traore's image in front of the Eiffel Tower. In Chicago, black youth painted murals of him next to Malcolm and Lumumba. Something had shifted. Traore was no longer just a president, he had become a symbol. Behind closed doors/threats turned to plots. That night, a meeting took place in a private hotel suite in D.C. Representatives from intelligence agencies, political donors, and private contractors sat around a long table. "He's uniting them," one said. "He's destabilizing decades of architecture," another added. The room went silent before a cold voice offered a solution. "Then we destabilize him." The countermove/a trap set in diplomacy. 2 days after the ceasefire resolution passed, the United States hosted a sudden security summit on Mideast stability in Geneva. Traore was invited. So was Netanyahu. But unlike before, this wasn't just a room of diplomats, it was filled with CEOs, weapons contractors, lobbyists, and intelligence officials disguised as aides. The tone was clear before anyone spoke. This isn't about peace anymore. It's about power. A polished stage/a poisoned atmosphere. The hall gleamed with luxury. Crystal chandeliers. Marble floors. Polished podiums. But beneath the surface, it was war dressed in silk. Traore entered, wearing a plain black tunic. He refused the assigned seat. Instead, he stood. And when Netanyahu took the stage and began with, "Israel will not be dictated to by fringe radicals," Traore cut him off with a single word. "Sit." Gasps filled the room. The room divided/the pressure rises. U.S. representatives shifted uncomfortably. Some scribbled notes. Others stared down at their phones. Netanyahu paused, visibly rattled, before continuing. "We defend democracy. We combat terror. We..." Traore interrupted again. "Calm. Precise. You bomb children and call it defense. You blockade and call it strategy. You are not defending anything. You are maintaining a lie." The audience was no longer neutral. They were frozen. The whisper campaign begins/Traore under fire. That evening, anonymous memos circulated. Claims that Traore had undisclosed ties to anti-Western factions. That Burkina Faso was accepting arms from Iran. That Traore was fueling radical Pan-Africanism with Russian backing. No proof. Just whispers. Planted. Deliberate. Spreading. His team reacts/they're scared of you. In his suite, one of Traore's aides showed him the reports. "They want you painted as a threat," she said. He simply nodded. "They always do, when they can no longer control the story." He turned back to the window, looking out over Geneva's moonlit lake. "Let them whisper. I'll speak where the world can hear." The stakes rise/the mask slips. The next morning, Traore received a direct invitation to a closed-door bilateral with U.S. Secretary of State Lauren Reese. No press. No recordings. Just 2 aides on either side. In the candlelit conference chamber of the Hotel de Bergues, Reese got to the point. "We believe your rhetoric is escalating tensions." Her voice was soft, but every syllable dripped with command. Traore didn't blink. "Is that a warning?" She folded her hands. "No. It's an opportunity. Step back. De-escalate. We can make sure your country receives infrastructure deals, vaccine shipments, perhaps even satellite access." He chuckled. "Cold. You offer me bread after torching the field?" The threat emerges/no more illusions. Reese's tone sharpened. "You've made enemies in every room you've entered this week. You may walk out of this summit isolated. Without Western support, Burkina Faso will. We'll do what we've always done," Traore cut in, "survive what you call diplomacy." She leaned forward. "You underestimate how dangerous it is to stand alone." "No," Traore said, "I understand it perfectly. And I'm willing to." The exit/a line drawn in silence. He stood. The room tensed. The two aides eyed each other, unsure whether to intervene. But Traore simply adjusted his coat and said, "Tell your president, Africa has decided not to be manageable anymore." And walked out. The world reacts/one image changes everything. By afternoon, a photo leaked. It showed Traore standing defiantly at the edge of the summit steps, 100 feet away from Netanyahu and the U.S. delegation. Caption: "The man who said no." It spread like wildfire. Within hours, African youth across Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal began uploading their own versions. "We say no. Africa chooses dignity. Not your colony." The US and Israel retaliate/words turn into action. That night, Burkina Faso's embassy in Paris was vandalized. A convoy of humanitarian aid trucks in Ouagadougou was blocked at the airport, security reasons, French officials claimed. And on X, formerly Twitter, U.S. Senator Blake Monroe tweeted, "This Traore is not a revolutionary. He's a destabilizer. Africa deserves better." Traore's reply was simple. Better than what? Being obedient? The final blow/a voice heard across continents. The summit's final day began with heavy silence. Delegates whispered rumors of sanctions, embargoes, covert retaliation. Some African leaders chose to skip the closing session altogether, fearing backlash from their Western donors. But Traore walked into the main chamber early. And waited. As Netanyahu approached the podium for his final speech, all eyes turned to the back of the room, where Traore rose and interrupted. "You do not get to speak last," he declared. The hall froze. The climactic confrontation/no more masks. "I was raised on the edges of empire." "You were raised at its table," Traore said, voice steady, deep. "And now, you drop bombs on children and call it peace." Netanyahu's lips curled. "You glorify resistance while we bury our dead." "You bury what you've bombed," Traore shot back. "And the world sees it." He stepped forward, locking eyes with the Israeli leader. "You said this ends when you say so. I say, this ends now." Global ripple/the room breaks. Silence. Then thunderous applause, from the South African delegation. Then Congo. Then Bolivia. Then Brazil. A slow-building wave of clapping and foot stomps spread through the chamber. Netanyahu looked around. Alone again. Traore didn't wait. He turned his back on the podium and walked out. The fallout/the unraveling begins. Within 24 hours, multiple African nations announced a freeze on military contracts with Israel. By the week's end, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger declared joint sanctions on arms companies supplying the Gaza bombings. The African Union released an emergency statement. "We stand with life. We choose justice. We will not be silent." The closing image/a new symbol. A photo from that moment would go viral. Traore standing in the center aisle, surrounded by diplomats rising to their feet, while Netanyahu stood stiffly at the front, frozen mid-sentence. The caption read, "One man said no, and the world listened."